Well, good afternoon, Victory family. As you know, we're not going to be meeting this Sunday for Easter. We will still celebrate Easter, but we're not going to meet this Sunday. We were scheduled to take communion, but since we're not going to be meeting together, I thought that maybe I would show you a little communion bread recipe. A couple things about this. There are kind of four reasons that I went with this recipe. First, it's easy. I think just about anybody could do it. Second, it's faithful to the scriptures. It is unleavened bread, and it's nothing fancy. It's actually a pretty ancient recipe, from what I can tell. Now, I'm not a cook historian or anything, but from what I can tell, this basic recipe is pretty ancient. Also, there are a lot of pantry ingredients in this, so hopefully, since we're all isolating or self-isolating ourselves, you won't have to go to the store to get anything. You already have all this. And finally, this is a very small batch. So the fourth reason I picked this is a very small batch, because you're only going to be making enough for you and your family, those in your family that are going to be partaking. All right, so what you'll need for this recipe is about a quarter cup of flour. I've got some extra flour here that you'll see we need that for in a little bit, and a little bit of water. We're actually going to end up using about a tablespoon and a half in the mix, and then we'll just add a little bit more if we need it. So to my quarter cup of flour, I'm going to just add a dash of salt, and then I'm going to add about that 1.5 tablespoons of water. Now, what you want this to be is a crumbly dough. So once it starts to come together, if it's too sticky, then you've got too much water in it, and you can add some more flour. But you want this to be a very crumbly dough. So I'm gonna mix it together. Now I'm using a fork to mix this together. You can use a dough hook, or a dough cutter as well if you want to. You see how this is a very crumbly dough. It's not really coming together, and that's pretty much what we want on that. Now at this point, I want to turn on my skillet. I have a cast iron skillet over here. I'm gonna turn it on to a medium high, about 6 or 7, and then while that's warming up, we can finish working on our dough. So we take this little bit of extra flour that we have here, and I'm going to sprinkle some on the countertop because we're going to roll this out. Now hopefully you cleaned your countertop before this point. We did already, and I also took my wedding band off because we're going to put some flour on our hands, and this is where it gets fun. We're going to take this dough and we're going to start to work it together. Now, the more that you work with the dough, the more chewy it's going to be, because you're going to get those glutens really going, that gluten. And so the more you knead it and the more you work with it, the tougher it's going to be, or the chewier it's going to be, and more stretchy. So what you can do at this point is start to flatten it out. Now I've seen some people use a rolling pin here. You can use a rolling pin if you want. So what we're doing is we're just trying to get it flat, and mostly circle. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle. I did one last night that was almost triangular, but the shape doesn't affect the flavor. That's just the presentation. Now, the more you work with it, the more chewy it's going to be, but at the same time, it's going to give it that nice breadiness. And so I'm trying to get this kind of flat and uniform. As you see, we don't have a big piece of bread here. We don't need a big piece of bread, but one of the good things about this recipe is that when you're using it for other things, in other dishes, you can change what seasonings you put into it, and so if you want to use more, do more, then you can. Now, our dough is just about ready to go. I'm just going to toss it around a little bit, knock some of the extra flour off, and I'm going to check on the pan. So let's see how our pan feels. I can feel some heat coming through, so I'm just going to take this and drop it in that almost dry pan. Now, while that's cooking, a couple things. The reason that we celebrate communion as a church is because in the Old Testament, when we read in Exodus chapter 12 that the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians. And when they were enslaved to the Egyptians, God chose Moses and asked Moses to go and to get his people and to bring them out of Egypt. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh and approaches Pharaoh and asks for his people, or asks for the Israelites to be released. And Pharaoh doesn't do that. Pharaoh doesn't comply. And so God sends in all these plagues to try to convince Pharaoh. And Pharaoh does not, it says his heart was hardened. And so in the 10th plague, God sends in the angel of death. But before that happens, he tells the Israelites that he wants them to make this special meal that they were going to call the Passover meal. One of the elements of the meal was this unleavened bread, and the reason that God told them for the bread to be unleavened was because they were kind of the whole meal was to be eaten, prepared and eaten kind of in a hurry, and they didn't want. It was kind of symbolic that they were getting ready to leave. God told them to pack their bags, have this meal with their sandals on, and standing by the table because they were getting ready to go. So the bread had to be unleavened. And then what they would do is they would slaughter a lamb and take the blood of the lamb and paint it over the doorposts. And when the angel of death came through the land, he would see the blood on the doorposts and know that that was the Israelites and that he wasn't supposed to go in and kill them. Now, it's about time to flip this over. We want it to cook for about 1 minute on each side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take it and flip it over. Now, I'm going to flip this a couple more times because that's not quite ready, but that's okay. As the angel of death was going through, he saw the blood painted over the doorposts, and he passed over the Israelites, and so none of the Israelites were killed. Now, when we read in the New Testament, in Luke 22, Jesus gives new meaning to this, the Passover meal, where Jesus says that the bread is symbolic of his body, and we want to use unleavened bread because Jesus was sinless. And then the wine represents Jesus' blood. You see, in the Old Testament story, the blood told the angel of death to pass over the Israelites. But Jesus' blood atones for our sin, excuses us from going to hell. So this Passover meal has new meaning for the New Testament church in Jesus' teachings. I'm going to give this another flip. And you can flip it basically until it's done. The more you flip it, it's not going to hurt it. Back when I used to grill a whole lot, I didn't want to flip the meats too much because I was told that if you flip it too much and it gets dry. But with this bread, it doesn't really matter. Now, another good thing about this recipe is that it's very adaptable. You can do it lots of different ways. If you're not making communion bread, you can add different seasonings to it. The other night, we used equal parts of boiled sweet potato and flour to make this flatbread, and it was delicious. I'm also thinking about doing one with some mashed banana and some peanut butter powder, and then cook it up and serve it with some jam or jelly or honey. But what we want to see is these little brown spots happening. That tells us that it's getting nice and toasted on the inside. You can press it down to help it get some equal coverage. Now, I know a bunch of you people at the church are probably laughing at me and saying I'm doing this all wrong, and that's okay because there's basically not a wrong way to do this unless your dough is not holding together. But this is starting to look like it's getting there. I'm going to get a plate for this so that it'll be ready to come out. Alright, our bread is just about cooked. If you like it to be a little bit more toasted, you can leave it in there a little bit longer. But it's just about ready to go now, so I'm going to go ahead and take it out and put it on the plate. Turn that off and get it out of the way. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pull this apart for y'all. It's still hot, but once it's done, you can pull it apart, and it pulls apart just like bread. Alright?